So, Lauren, in addition to you being in the studio here with me, you have also brought some very special guests. Can you introduce us?
So we have just a plethora of everyone's favorite snacks in the U.S. here. We've got Nature Valley granola bars.
Ooh, I've eaten many of those in my time.
Yes, absolutely.
And then you got to pass the Cheetos over because that's my jam.
Yeah, the Cheetos. The Cheetos are looking quite orange and exciting over here.
Crunchy.
What you're hearing is health and science reporter Lauren Weber going through this big box of snacks with my co-host Martine Powers.
The fact that they put crunchy on it, it's like there aren't any Cheetos that aren't crunchy, but just the fact that they say crunchy makes me want to eat them more because I'm like, they are crunchy.
They are
so
orange finger-licking snacks that everybody loves to have. And then you've got Cheerios, which you got the big old box with the big old heart on the front. And
yes, the heart that says a lot. I feel like whenever I see the heart with the Cheerios in it, I'm like, yeah, heart healthy, great for a great nutritional value.
And then you've got red Gatorade, everybody's favorite from...
There's a reason Lauren has brought these in, I promise. But for now, Martine is getting a little hungry.
All kinds of fun names. And on top of that, we've also got Goldfish. Which...
Classic.
You know you've seen kids with these out and about.
If I could, tabulate the amount of goldfish that I've eaten over the course of my life, I'm sure it would be literal barrels.
I mean, they're just these little fish. It's quite an array of foods that people really love to snack on.
Lauren isn't showing off these snacks because she wants to know Martine's favorite. Lauren brought them in because she's been laser focused on how food like this is labeled. You see, a lot of countries around the world put warning labels on the front of packaged foods, warning consumers about high levels of salt, sugar, and fat in everything from potato chips to granola bars.
The world looks at food differently. They attach different warning labels to it. And that's in part due to the fact that the World Health Organization has really started to advise folks that food warning labels may be necessary in light of the rising obesity epidemic that we're seeing around the world. But here in the U.S., you're not seeing any of that kind of front of pack labeling.
But Lauren says that could soon change. The U.S. Food and Drug Administration plans to propose requiring labels on the front of certain drinks and food packages.
All kinds of food, every food that you can imagine, every food at the grocery store, to warn American consumers against unhealthy products, potentially as early as this fall. But that's really years after other countries have taken similar action to go after exploding obesity rates.
From the newsroom of The Washington Post, this is Post Reports. I'm Elahe Izadi. It's Monday, September 23rd. Today, food warning labels could be coming to a grocery store near you. We'll hear about whether these labels could help Americans get healthier and the growing pushback to this proposal. I'll let Martine and Lauren take it from here.
So, Lauren, there's one thing about the food that we're going to be talking about in this conversation, which is that it's often considered ultra-processed food. Beyond the fact that that means that it's generally delicious and crunchy, what does that mean?
So ultra-processed foods means that these are often industrial produced, they're hyper-palatable, they contain potentially high levels of sodium, fat, and added sugar. And nutrition experts and lawmakers are starting to get really worried about the amount of ultra-processed foods they're seeing Americans consume. Ultra-processed foods make up 57% of our diets. That's a lot of our diets. And several studies have started to identify that these foods can be a risk factor for nutrition-related conditions such as cardiovascular disease, diabetes, and cancer, which then can contribute to shortening Americans' lifespans.
And my sense is that not everyone completely understands that all of these foods are considered ultra-processed foods. Like, I mean, the Cheetos here, I have to say, I think you'd be hard-pressed to find someone who thinks that Cheetos are a nutritional food. But think about Cheerios. How many kids are, eating Cheerios for breakfast every day, and it's considered, part of a, normal American breakfast? Or Nature Valley granola bars. I mean, I've eaten a bunch of those. It's like, oh, I just had a workout, and I'm just going to have a granola bar after, and this feels pretty healthy. But that it's not clear to everyone, and I think even to me, that in many cases, nutritionists believe that these foods are not considered totally great for you.
So a team of researchers that we talked to from the University of North Carolina said that's kind of the point, honestly, is that Americans have no idea what's in their food, what makes up any of the ingredients that are in it, and the fact that they are so industrial processed. And they said Americans have no idea. And they say that's in part because there are not food labels on the front of your food to kind of tell you that, or to give you sort of any indication that the nutrition of them may not be what you expect. And so we've seen this pushed. The Biden-Harris administration's Food and Drug Administration has been toying with putting out front of package labels.
Wait, so what is a front of package label, and how is that different from a back of package label? Because I mean, when I look at the goldfish here, right?
Yeah.
No, there's nothing on the front that tells you specifically about the nutritional value. But if you go to the side, it says the calories and the fat and the sodium, and it has the little percent daily value, so you can kind of do the math in your head of, well, if I had 10 servings of this, it would be all the sodium that I'm supposed to have today. So in terms of what the Food and Drug Administration is trying to push here, what is a front of package label?
So a front of package label is supposed to be designed to be easy to understand, so that you pick up goldfish, for instance, which you were just holding, and you can say, oh, there are different ingredients in this than I realized, or, oh, this is high in sodium, or, oh, this is high in XYZ. And I mean, you mentioned how you can go to the back of the nutrition package and do the calculation in your head. This is how much sodium I need for the day. But a lot of Americans don't do that. And a lot of people all over the world don't spend that much time doing that. So a front of package label is supposed to make it easier for you to understand if the item you're considering buying is healthy or not.
And who is pushing for this? You mentioned this is something that the Food and Drug Administration is trying to advocate, but are there lawmakers who are into this idea?
So we've seen actually Senator Bernie Sanders has proposed legislation that would have very strict front of package labeling, and would go even a step further and have special labels for ultra processed foods or sugar sweetened beverages that are almost like cigarette warning labels.
Where we are right now, the labeling tells us that if you smoke cigarettes, you're going to get cancer and other diseases. It's real. But the labeling we have now on food products clearly is totally inadequate. It gives you some numbers which don't necessarily mean anything to anybody. It tells you how many grams of added sugars you may have. So what? What does that mean?
Well, let me ask more about this argument that we just heard Senator Sanders make about how, look, cigarettes aren't good for us. And we decided at some point as a country that we are going to warn people about the potential harms of cigarettes. We've seen how the requirements around those labels have escalated over the years to ensure that essentially if you're buying cigarettes at the drugstore or wherever, that there is something screaming at you as you're buying them to make sure that you know that you're making a dangerous decision. But at the same time, goldfish are not cigarettes. I mean, goldfish are something that many, I would argue maybe most Americans, eat with some frequency, or, it's just a food. What is the argument that a snack food deserves the same treatment as tobacco?
Many nutritionists and even Bernie Sanders would argue that the obesity epidemic here in the U.S. means you cannot look away.
And obviously, we got to ask the question, why? Why has there been a staggering increase in the number of kids who are obese?
They say that rates have just exploded at such high numbers that more intervention needs to be done to combat food choices at its source. They say that these warning labels that could go on the food are really just to help Americans make a better choice. Much like cigarettes, you can still choose to smoke cigarettes, but they argue that by having more of a front of pack label, you're actually making a better decision about your food choices.
I can imagine that the people who make these snack foods are not necessarily excited about this idea.
No, the food companies, food industries have been pushing very hard against this potential FDA proposal to add warning labels to packaged foods. They say that there would be First Amendment challenges likely if this were to come through.
Oh, interesting. Like this is a free speech issue that they should be able to put whatever they want on the front of their package?
Yes, they say the First Amendment does protect the right to commercial free speech, and they say that this would interfere with that. They've questioned the FDA's legal authority to even propose something like this. They're really coming out guns blazing against this approach, and the proposal hasn't even been seen yet. This is just from the conversations where it could be coming.
So it's already clear that this is becoming a huge battle.
Yes, the food fight has yet to even completely begin, and guns are slinging.
Coming up, Lauren and Martine talk about how food warnings have worked in other countries and what they could look like here in the U.S. We'll be right back.
And Lauren, as you mentioned at the beginning of our conversation, other countries have tackled this problem differently, and they have approached how they label their food differently. Can you describe a little bit more of what we've seen internationally in terms of the ways that they have approached this issue maybe more aggressively?
Absolutely. I mean, if you go to Chile, for instance, you'll see what amount to black stop signs on food items like Goldfish or Cheetos or Cheerios if they're sold in that country.
A stop sign, like just a big octagon on the thing that's... Yeah, I mean, does it say stop?
It's a big black stop sign shape, so octagonal shaped, and it'll say this is high in calories, this is high in saturated fat, this is high in sugar.
Do you have an example of what that looks like on the label?
Yeah, absolutely. So here, take a look. This is actually a version of Goldfish.
Oh. Yeah, at the top of the bag, it has these two, as you said, stop signs. And one says exceso calorías, which I assume means lots of calories. Exceso sodio, which I assume is a lot of sodium, from the Secretary of Health. And it's just there. It's like, it says Goldfish, but right on top of the Goldfish is the two stop signs.
Yeah, it's so I actually talked to a nutrition scientist about these labels in other countries, Natalia Rebiedo.
I'm a nutrition research scientist at the University of Chile. And I spent time in the United States. I did my PhD in the University of North Carolina.
So Natalia sees both sides of this. I mean, she's been assessing Chile's food label system, but then when she comes to the U.S., she finds herself really disoriented in grocery stores here. The way she describes it, she has a lot of trouble understanding what's in foods in the U.S. and their nutritional content.
It was very challenging. I was like, I'm a nutrition scientist. I've been studying nutrition for a long time, and I'm struggling identifying which product will be healthier. And I cannot imagine how it will be for people that is not actually trained on this.
She says it was wild for her coming from Chile, where everything now has these kind of warning labels if foods are high in sugar, salt, saturated fat, or calories. None of that exists here in the U.S. And the serving sizes are different in the U.S., and the way nutrition is presented in food is very different in the U.S.
For example, I remember I purchased a chocolate saying that was 80% cacao, and then I purchased it and tried it, and it was like salty. I was like, where is this information? Why I didn't realize this has added salt here? So in Chile, if I go to a supermarket and I purchase a chocolate that has a lot of added salt, for example, I will be able to identify that by looking at the warning label.
And to be clear, Chile is not the only place that has added clear front-of-package labeling about foods that are high in sugar, salt, and fat. I recently went to Mexico and realized in the airport, everything has these labels on it. And it's kind of wild to see these black labels all over the place.
And what are the other countries where you've seen this, like a labeling system that is more robust than ours?
So Chile, Mexico, Peru, Israel, those are the countries that have really implemented kind of more of the strictest labeling system. But if you go to the UK, Australia, lots of other places, you'll see some voluntary food labeling systems, some other types of food labeling systems that get at that at the front of the package, not just at the back like we do here in the U.S. And they go further than just the food labels. Many of those laws also attack advertising so that you can't necessarily have fun little characters on the front of your packages, or you can't have advertising to kids in particular. Here in the US, we don't have anything like that. And I spoke to researchers and health experts in Australia, the UK, Mexico, Colombia. Many of them said they fought huge uphill battles to get some of this stuff through. But what they identified as being different from the US is that their legal system allowed for more flexibility and they had more grassroots support. Here in the US, they say they don't see the same amount of grassroots energy. And they also say that they don't have the same kind of First Amendment protections that protect companies and industry like we have here in the US.
Let me ask this. Do those labels work in other countries? Like when they put the stop signs on the packages, does that actually change people's behavior?
What researchers say is that this implementation of some of these front of pack labels is showing that some consumers are making healthier choices. And the idea being from the FDA and the World Health Organization, which encourages the use of these front of pack labels, is to help people all around the world make better choices for themselves. So it's interesting. We saw that the Chile's front of package warning labels were associated with significant decreases in the overall calories, sugar, sodium, and saturated fat contained in foods purchased by consumers.
What does that mean? Like basically that people are eating less of it, or that they're eating more healthily? Well, it means a couple
things. It also could mean that the products themselves, after you were going to have to affix different labels to them, reformulated so that they reduce the levels of sugar, saturated fat, sodium, calories.
Oh, interesting. That they were so motivated to not have the stop sign on their food that they were like, let's change the recipe so that we don't have to have this annoying sign.
Absolutely. And to be fair, the Consumer Brands Association, which is a food industry lobbying group, said the labels don't work. They pointed to obesity rates in Chile and said they've increased since the country put these labels in effect in 2016. But researchers noted that that data includes COVID, when obesity rates skyrocketed, and that oftentimes food labels are just part of a toolkit of public health tools to kind of tackle this obesity problem. I think what's really interesting is that researchers I spoke to said that what's novel about these food packaging is that even kids can identify that this is a product that they don't necessarily think is the best idea. And that kids have really been a source of encouraging their parents to make healthier food options. They also caution that food labels like this, it's not like they solve an obesity problem overnight. This is a behavioral change suggestion. And early research indicates that the children are the one who seem to understand it and grasp it the most. And some of the focus groups that I've read about or talked to different experts about kind of highlighted that kids will be like, their parents will say, oh, you can have a snack with 2 stop signs, but not 3 or 4. Or, oh, that's a special treat some of the time. And that some of these kids maybe now have...
The Cookie Monster rule, right? This is a sometimes food and not an always food.
Absolutely. So it allows a way to equalize food in a different way than we see in the U.S., right? Because you have these nutrition labels on the back. Serving sizes are so different for every package. But when you have these warning labels that can kind of tell you, oh, there's 2 stop signs or 3 or 4 or just 1, you have a better sense of, is this something that I want to be eating, or should I be eating all stop sign foods all the time, or do I save this as a treat? And it creates kind of a different incentive structure that children in particular have been quick to catch on to. One of the experts I spoke to, Marion Nestle, who is not associated with the Nestle company, in case anyone was wondering, but she is a professor at NYU. She said, look, the point of food labels is to have food labels that are easy enough for kids to understand. You want to be able to go through the grocery store and look around and glance to the left and to your right and have a better sense of what's good or not good for me to be buying. So if you have food labels that are confusing, it kind of defeats the point of having them, she argued, and many of the other folks I talked to argued.
So, Lauren, when you talk about how the FDA is trying to propose this new rule that would require these food companies to change the packaging on the front side of the boxes and bags of snacks that we buy, would that look like what you described in other countries? Would it be this big stop sign? Like, how would that look according to what the U.S. government is trying to advocate for here?
So we at The Post had a team of researchers from the University of North Carolina take a look at what some of these popular food companies would end up having to do if the FDA proposal does come through. And I can show you. So one of the options is a kind of square that has a traffic light schematic on it.
Oh, because it's like the yellow, green, red colors.
Yes, because it has yellow, green, and some red colors. If you have low saturated fat, you got a green color and a low next to it. If it's medium, you get a yellow color. If it's red, you get a red color next to it. So it's kind of the stoplight scheme that's supposed to be easier for the consumer to understand. You look at it and see colors. One of the other FDA proposals is kind of a box that just says high in, and then it has...
Oh, interesting.
Here, let's take a look at it. And then it has the nutrients that it's high in, which would be either sugar, saturated fat, or sodium.
So it's high in added sugars, high in sodium.
Yes. But many nutrition experts and even some lawmakers that we talk to feel like the FDA's version that could be proposed is not clear enough for the consumer to really have an impact that could help them make healthier choices.
So it seems like the challenge here for the people who are advocating for more nutrition labels is that they don't even agree on what those labels would look like here in the U.S. That there's this range of options, some of which are more aggressive, some of which are less so, and that there's a difference on like that they're not in agreement about what that should actually look like.
That's exactly right. And on top of that, you have the food industry trying to not have some of these labels of any of these kinds come to packages. They don't want the octagonal labels. They don't want the stop light schematic labels. They don't want the high-end labels. They instead have proposed an alternate system where they can choose the nutrients they want to highlight on the front of packaging, which could include things like fiber or other things.
You mentioned briefly that a lot of the food industry isn't excited about the potential for these labels, but I know that you reached out specifically to some of these companies that we're talking about, the people who make the Cheerios and the Cheetos and the Goldfish. Can you just describe some of those conversations with them, like how they're thinking about this attempt at getting them to change their packaging?
So General Mills, which is the parent company for Cheerios and Nature Valley granola bars, told us in a statement that while they're tracking the FDA proposals, they remain focused on meeting consumers' nutrition and taste needs. PepsiCo, which owns Gatorade and also owns Cheetos, did not respond to our request for comment. And the Campbell Soup Company, which actually is the parent company of Goldfish under its Pepperidge Farms brand.
That makes sense because I do like putting Goldfish in soup.
That's exactly right. They said that the brand's packaging complies with all existing FDA scenarios currently and that they're not going to respond to hypothetical scenarios.
Mm-hmm. My question here, though, is, okay, the food industry, by and large, probably doesn't want it, and it sounds like some folks in the government do want it. Do Americans actually want these labels on their food?
I mean, it's a great question. I think what's interesting to compare the U.S. to other countries is you've seen in other countries like Colombia more of a grassroots movement to get labels like this on the front of food, to get more advertising restrictions, to push back against industry. You're not really seeing that here. You are starting to see more interest about ultra-processed foods, but we haven't seen a massive grassroots effort for people asking to have these be on the front of packages as of yet.
And in terms of how the FDA has been thinking about all this, what did they have to say when you talked to them about the prospect of these food labels?
So the FDA made it clear to us that they feel like they're following the legal authority that they have with the proposals that they have. But researchers say, reading between the lines, that means they didn't think they had the legal authority to really pursue these black octagonal warning labels like you're seeing in other countries. But what complicates this is that there was a recent Supreme Court decision that could potentially further curtail the FDA's authority in this arena. That decision essentially says that when a law is ambiguous or Congress does not specify its intentions, it can be challenged in court.
So where does that leave us as people who go to the grocery store, buy food, want to understand what's in our food? Like, what are we supposed to make of the fact that all of this feels pretty complicated and murky right now?
Well, it's all one big food fight to some extent. I mean, I think that as American consumers, we're kind of in a limbo to some extent. This proposal hasn't come out yet. It could come out this fall. It could get shelved. I mean, looking at the election ahead, it really depends on who wins the presidency if this policy were to go through at all, even if it is proposed in October. You know, former President Donald Trump, when he was president, did not appear to care for food labels. And while the Biden-Harris administration has told us that they are supporters of this proposal, industry continues to say that such a proposal would drive up food prices, which is not an appetizing message right before an election. So who knows? But in the meantime, we'll be going to the grocery store aisle and seeing what pops up on the shelf.
Lauren, thank you so much for unpacking all of this.
Thank you so much for having me. It's always fun to talk about food with the crew.
Did you see what I did there?
Yes, I did see what you did there. I'm very impressed. I need to come up with some better food puns.
Thank you for your very generous chuckle.
Lauren Weber is a health and science accountability reporter at The Post, and she reported the story with Rachel Rubine. Lauren spoke with my co-host Martine Powers. Before we sign off, I wanted to update you on two big stories I'm watching. First, tensions are reaching a fever pitch on the border between Israel and Lebanon. That's the sound of explosions, as heard from the Lebanese side of the border. Monday was the deadliest day in Lebanon since Israel and the militant group Hezbollah started exchanging fire last October. That's when the Gaza war escalated tensions in the region. At least 274 people have been killed and at least 1,024 wounded in Israeli strikes. That's according to Lebanon's health ministry. That count doesn't distinguish between civilians and combatants, but the ministry said children, women, and paramedics are included. Israel said it was conducting, quote, extensive, precise strikes against Hezbollah and called for civilians to evacuate from areas where the militant group is active. Also, we're learning new details about the apparent assassination attempt on former President Donald Trump's life from earlier this month. The gunman arrested near Trump's Florida golf course wrote a letter to a friend months ago. According to a court filing, Ryan Ruth wrote, quote, "Dear world, this was an assassination attempt on Donald Trump, but I failed you. I tried my best and gave it all my gumption I could muster." Ruth is being held on gun charges. He didn't fire shots at the course, so prosecutors had a tough time holding him on more serious charges. But this new evidence could make it easier for prosecutors to bring more serious charges because they could argue that Ruth intended to kill Trump. To keep up with this story, go to WashingtonPost.com for the latest. That's it for Post Reports. Thanks for listening. Today's episode was produced by Alana Gordon with help from Ariel Plotnick. It was edited by Monica Campbell and mixed by Sean Carter. Thanks to Tracy Jan. I'm Elahe Izadi. We'll be back tomorrow with more stories from The Washington Post.